He rode home expecting to find ruins. 3 years. 3 winters. 3 years of surviving on nothing but frozen creek water and sheer stubbornness, while everyone back home marked him dead and moved on. Wade Mercer had imagined this moment 1,000 times on those mountain slopes, coming over the ridge, seeing the collapsed fences, the dead cattle, the empty house rotting back into the earth, the way abandoned things always do. Instead, smoke was curling from his chimney. The fences were standing, the cattle were fat, and a woman he had never seen in his life was standing on his porch, watching him ride in with steady eyes like she'd been expecting him, like she had something to say that was going to change everything. If you want to know how a forgotten act of kindness crossed 3 years of wilderness and came back to save a man's life, hit that like button, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels, and don't go anywhere. The horse smelled home before Wade did. Biscuit, a 15-year-old roan with a white blaze down his nose and a disposition that had soured considerably over 3 years of mountain travel, lifted his head about a mile out from the valley ridge and began pulling at the bit with a purpose he hadn't shown since before the expedition. Wade let him have his head. He was too exhausted to argue with a horse. The descent from the Absaroka Range had taken 12 days on foot after Biscuit threw a shoe and Wade couldn't risk pushing him on the loose shale. 12 days of walking with his rifle across his shoulders, eating whatever moved slow enough to catch, sleeping under a canvas sheet that had more holes than a man could comfortably count. He'd come down through the timber country east of the Yellowstone and picked up a rough road outside of a place called Rattlesnake Crossing, where a freight hauler named Ezra Potts had taken one look at him, gaunt-faced, beard down to his collar, clothes that had been repaired so many times they were more patches than original cloth, and offered him a ride without being asked. That was 2 days ago. Potts had let him off at the boundary of Coulter County and wished him luck with the careful neutrality of a man who wasn't sure the person in front of him was going to make it. Wade had said thank you and meant it. Now, coming down through the timber toward the Mercer place, he was having trouble holding a coherent thought. His mind kept skipping like a stone across water. His wife, Margaret's face, the cattle, the eastern pasture that always flooded in spring, his foreman, Deke, who'd been 63 years old when they left and hadn't come back at all. He thought about the bank and what 3 years of missed mortgage payments looked like on paper. He thought about the cold, which was never entirely out of his mind anymore, even now in the mild October air. He thought about coming around this bend in the road and seeing nothing but collapsed walls and high grass. Biscuit took the bend at a walk. Wade Mercer pulled him up and sat in the saddle for a long moment without moving. Smoke. Real smoke, not wildfire or brush burning, but chimney smoke, pale gray and steady against the white October sky. It rose from the main house chimney, and there was something so ordinary about it, so domestic, that Wade felt his throat do something complicated. The fence line along the creek road was standing. More than standing. It was new lumber, or recently repaired lumber, light pine that hadn't weathered to gray yet. The post tops were still bright where they'd been cut. Someone had driven those posts in the last season or two. The south pasture had cattle in it, maybe 30 head from where he sat, Herefords mostly, and they looked solid. Not the scrubby, ribby look of animals that had gotten through a hard year on willpower alone, but genuinely solid animals with good depth through the barrel. The grass was grazed down but not hammered. Someone was rotating them. Wade put his heels to Biscuit and rode down. The closer he got, the more he saw. The barn roof had been patched. He could see where the old shingles ended and the new ones began, a clean line about a third of the way across. The chicken yard had birds in it. The kitchen garden on the south side of the house was cut back for winter, but cut back properly, not abandoned. Someone had put in a winter bed of cold crops, kale and turnips by the look of the leaves, still green against the dark soil. He was close enough to see the porch now. She was standing at the top of the steps with her arms crossed over her chest and her head tilted slightly, watching him come. He didn't recognize her. He knew every woman in Coulter County. It was not a large place, and she was not one of them. She was somewhere in her mid-30s with dark hair pulled back, practical and simple, wearing a canvas work apron over a gray wool dress that had seen considerable use. There was a smear of something, flour or ash, along her left forearm. She didn't look startled. She didn't look afraid. She looked like a woman waiting for a conversation she'd been expecting for some time. Wade stopped Biscuit at the bottom of the porch steps. They regarded each other. He took off his hat because Margaret had raised him to take his hat off in the presence of women, and that particular habit hadn't been beaten out of him by 3 years in the mountains. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. A pause. The kind that had weight in it. "I'm going to guess," he said carefully, "that you already know who I am. Wade Mercer." She said it plain, not like a question. "Though I'll admit, you're considerably thinner than I expected." "You were expecting me?" "Not on any particular day." She came down one step but stopped there. "I knew you'd either come back or you wouldn't. I figured I ought to be ready either way." Wade looked at the fence line, the cattle, the patched barn roof. He looked back at her. "You've been here a while." 2 years and about 4 months. He turned that over. "Alone?" "Mostly." "The bank?" "Is current." He stared at her. "The mortgage is current." "Yes." "Ma'am, I don't—" He stopped, started again. "I don't know how to ask this without sounding ungrateful for something I don't yet understand, so I'm just going to ask it plain. Who are you, and what are you doing on my land?" Something in her expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but something gentler than the careful, neutral face she'd been wearing. "My name is Clara Whitlock," she said, "and that's a longer answer than you look like you have the energy for right now." She turned and went up the steps. "Come inside. I'll feed you first." He ate like a man who had not sat at a table in 3 years, because he hadn't. She put a bowl of bean soup in front of him and a plate of cornbread, and didn't say anything while he worked through the first bowl and most of the second. The kitchen was his kitchen. He knew every inch of it, the warped floorboard by the stove, the window latch that never sat quite right, but it was also changed in small ways. There were herbs drying from a beam he didn't remember using for that purpose. The cookware was arranged differently. The table had a new crossbar underneath where the old one had cracked. There were 2 chairs on the same side of the table, he noticed, which meant she'd been using one of them as a work surface and had moved it when he came in. She'd been eating alone at that table for 2 years and 4 months. He ate. She sat with a mug of coffee and waited. When he finally pushed the second bowl back and looked at her, she began. She'd homesteaded a quarter section about 40 miles south, she said. Came out from Missouri after her husband Thomas died of a fever in the summer of 1879, about a year before Wade's expedition. She'd had a small piece of land and a small herd and a debt to the feed merchant in Garrison that had gotten away from her after Thomas passed, and the drought that year took most of her crop. "I was 3 days from losing the property," she said. "I couldn't cover the debt. I'd been to every neighbor I had, every person I knew, and there was nothing. I was packing what I could carry." Wade nodded. He'd seen that story play out before. It wasn't uncommon. "A man came to my door," she said. "I'd never seen him before. He said he'd heard from someone in town that I was in a bad spot." She looked down at her coffee mug. "He paid the feed merchant directly, the full amount, came to my door and handed me the receipts and said the debt was settled. And then? And then he left." Wade was quiet for a moment. "He didn't say what he wanted in return?" "He said nothing in return. I asked him his name, and he said it didn't matter." She looked up. "I found out later from the merchant who he was. He'd already left town by then." The kitchen was quiet enough that Wade could hear the wind coming around the corner of the house. He had a strange feeling beginning somewhere in his chest, the kind of feeling that comes when you are about to be surprised by your own past. "How much?" he said. $64. He remembered it. He'd been passing through on a supply run, heard something from the Garrison merchant himself about a widow about to lose her place. He didn't remember making a decision exactly. He just remembered that it had seemed wrong to walk past it. He had not thought about it since. "That was me," he said. "I know." He looked at her. "You've been—" He stopped. "You've been here for 2 years and 4 months because of $64. Because of what it meant," she said quietly. "There's a difference." He didn't answer right away. He was looking at the herbs drying from his beam and the new crossbar on his table and thinking about the repaired fence and the 30 cattle in his south pasture. "Why didn't you just—" He shook his head. "There's easier ways to settle a debt. You could have found someone to pass word, sent money." "I didn't have money to send." She said it without apology. "And when the debt is that kind, money isn't what you pay it back with." She turned the coffee mug in her hands. When I heard you'd died, or everyone thought you'd died, I heard your ranch was going to be taken. The bank was already talking about it in Garrison. So you came. So I came. He got up from the table and went to the window and looked out at the south pasture where his cattle stood in the October light. He needed something to do with his hands. You had your own place, he said. You sold it? I sold what I could, used it to cover the first payment here and put some seed in the ground. She was quiet for a moment. It was a hard first year. He turned from the window. Hard. A pipe in the well cracked that first winter. Lost most of the kitchen garden to rabbits before I got the fence sorted. Cattle got into the creek quarter and one of them broke a leg and I had to... She stopped. It was a hard year, she said again. Second one was better. He didn't know what to say to her. He wasn't sure any of the usual words applied to what she'd done. You didn't know I was coming back, he said. No. You didn't know I was alive. No. So you were... He was having trouble finishing the sentence. You were keeping this place alive for a dead man. She looked at him steadily. I was keeping it alive because it deserved to be kept alive. Because you did something that nobody had any reason to do, and I didn't think that ought to end in the bank taking everything. Wade sat back down at the table. He wasn't sure his legs were going to keep cooperating with him much longer anyway. Clara Whitlock, he said. Yes, I owe you an apology. She looked faintly startled. That was the first time anything he'd said had landed on her face as surprise. For what? For making this necessary. He meant it. He'd ridden out on that cattle expedition knowing the season looked bad, knowing the passes had been treacherous the year before, and he'd gone anyway because he needed the money from the drive, and he'd been stubborn about it. If he hadn't been stubborn, none of this would have happened to her. You gave up your place, he said. Your home. For mine. I gave up a quarter section that was already half dead and a one-room house with a bad roof, she said. Don't make it sound more than it was. It's more than it was. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't read. Eat some more cornbread, she said. You look like you're going to blow away. He spent the first 3 days mostly sleeping. He hadn't let himself sleep properly in months. Real, deep sleep in a house, under a roof that didn't leak, on a bed with a proper mattress. His body took the opportunity seriously. He would sleep 12 hours and wake and eat and sleep again, and Clara would leave food on the table and check on the cattle and split the day's wood and generally operate the ranch with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing it alone for 2 years and didn't require supervision. On the fourth day, he woke before dawn feeling more like himself and went out to help with morning chores. She was already in the barn. They worked in the particular silence of two people who don't know each other's rhythms yet. She fed the horses while he pitched hay into the cattle stalls, and they arrived at the same passage between the stall rows at the same moment and had to navigate around each other awkwardly. You muck left-handed, she said, watching him. Always have. I'll remember that. It shouldn't have been funny. It wasn't particularly funny, but something in the straightness of how she said it made him smile for the first time, and he didn't know how long. And then she smiled slightly too, and they went back to work. By the end of the first week, he had a clearer picture of what she'd done and what it had cost. She had sold her quarter section for $900, a figure so low that it told him something about the state it was in when she sold it. She had used that money to catch the Mercer Ranch mortgage up to current. It had been 3 payments behind, and then covered the next 4 herself, one at a time, by selling cattle at prices she openly described as terrible, because she'd had no leverage and the buyers knew it. She had paid, by her accounting, about $200 out of her own pocket over 2 years beyond the initial investment. She had fixed the barn roof using timber she'd cut herself and floated down the creek on a makeshift raft because she couldn't afford hauled lumber. She had nursed 2 cattle through a respiratory illness that had killed 6 of her neighbor's animals that same winter. She had dug out the flooded culvert in the east field with a hand shovel over 4 days in April mud. By yourself, Wade said, when she told him about the culvert. I asked Denny Hobart's boy to help, but he wanted too much for it, and I was short that week. She said it matter-of-factly. She had a way of relating disasters as though they were accounting entries. The culvert took 4 days. The roof cost her a bruised palm and 2 broken nails. The cattle illness was managed with a sulfur treatment she'd read about in an agricultural circular and applied herself. None of it had been smooth. None of it had gone the way she'd planned it. There were a dozen moments he could hear in her telling where a different person would have quit. She never said that. She never said it was hard or I thought about leaving. He had to hear it in the parts she skipped over. The winter of '81, he said on Wednesday evening, when they were sitting at the table going over the mortgage ledger she'd kept. That was a bad one. The third worst since I came west, she said, without looking up from the ledger page. What happened here? A pause. She ran her finger down a column of numbers. Lost 4 animals to the cold. Couldn't get to Garrison for 6 weeks because the south road was drifted shut. Ran low on lamp oil. She turned the page. February was the worst of it. How low on lamp oil? She looked up. What do you mean? I mean, how did you manage? She looked at him for a moment. Went to bed when it got dark, she said simply. Same as most people do. He thought about that. 6 weeks snowed in, 4 cattle dead, darkness at 4 in the afternoon, alone. You should have left, he said. Not a criticism. He meant it genuinely. Nobody would have blamed you. I would have, she said. And that was the end of that conversation. He found Margaret's grave on Thursday. He hadn't gone looking for it exactly. He'd been walking the fence line on the west side of the property, checking the posts, and he'd come around behind the hill that overlooked the creek, and there it was. The grave itself was where he'd left it, where he'd buried his wife 3 years ago in that terrible autumn before the expedition, when the fever had taken her in 5 days and left him so gutted he'd made the decision to go on the cattle drive, partly because he couldn't bear to be in that house anymore. But the grave was different than he'd left it. Someone had put a proper stone. Not a rough field stone, but a cut piece of limestone, not large, with Margaret's name carved into it, and the years, 1849 to 1880. He ran his finger along the letters. The carving was simple but careful. Not a stonemason's work, but not amateur either. Someone had taken time with it. There were dried flowers at the base. Yarrow, mostly, and what might have been wild asters once. They'd been there long enough to fade, but they were tied neatly and placed with intention. He stood there for a long time. When he came back to the house, Clara was at the stove, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her. She must have felt him standing there because she turned. The stone, he said. She turned back to the stove. I had it done the second spring. There was a man in Garrison who did stonework. You paid for that? Yes. Clara. She set down the spoon she was holding and turned to face him fully. There was something careful in her expression, like she was waiting to hear what he said next. I left a wooden cross, he said. I left a wooden cross because I couldn't... He stopped. I was going to do better when I got back from the drive. You did what you could at the time, she said. You barely knew her. I knew what she meant to you. She said it simply, the way she said most things. And I knew what a wooden cross in a Montana winter was going to look like in 2 years. Wade Mercer had held himself together through 3 years of cold and starvation and watching good men die in blizzards. He had kept himself together through 12 days of walking alone out of the mountains. He had made himself keep moving when every part of him wanted to stop. He did not keep it together standing in his kitchen doorway, looking at a woman who had put a stone on his dead wife's grave. He turned and went back outside. He walked to the barn and sat down on a hay bale and spent about 10 minutes being thoroughly undone, which he would not have described to another living person for any amount of money. Then he washed his face at the trough, fed biscuit and apple he didn't have, and went back inside to help with supper. By the end of the second week, the neighbors started showing up. First was Carl Hobart, whose property ran along the creek road, a big weathered man in his 50s who shook Wade's hand with both of his and said, 3 times in a row, damn glad you're not dead, with the particular sincerity of someone who means it exactly as literally as they're saying it. Clara kept us informed, Hobart said, standing in the yard with his hat in his hands. When you were overdue, I mean. Sent word around that you'd gone on the drive. He glanced toward the house. She came to me that first winter, asked if she could buy hay, paid fair price, cash money. He scratched the back of his neck. Hell of a woman. She is, Wade agreed. Town was... Hobart stopped. People had opinions, when she first came, I mean. Woman alone on a dead man's property. He chose his words in the way of a man who had been part of the opinions and is now finding them somewhat embarrassing. She handled it. How did she handle it? Just kept working, Hobart said. Every time somebody showed up with an opinion, she'd be in the middle of something, fencing or mucking or building that channel repair on the east culvert, and they'd kind of lose interest in the opinion. He put his hat back on. Hard to argue with a woman who's up to her knees in a drainage ditch. The banker came on Friday. His name was Aldous Crane, and he was a thin, pale man from back east who had never been entirely comfortable with the physical reality of the frontier, and who managed his discomfort by carrying himself as though he were operating in slightly better circumstances than the ones currently surrounding him. He shook Wade's hand with the professional warmth of a man very aware of how much money was in play. "Mr. Mercer, we were—" He paused. "Well, I'll be honest with you. We were about 2 months from beginning foreclosure proceedings when Mrs. Whitlock arrived. She told me." Crane's gaze slid to the house and back. "The arrangement going forward, the mortgage gets paid," Wade said. "Same as it's been." "Yes, but Mrs. Whitlock's name isn't on the—" "Work that out with your paperwork," Wade said. "I'll come in next week." Crane opened his mouth, thought better of it, and left. That evening, Wade told Clara about the conversation, and she listened carefully, and then she said, "I'll need to go back to Garrison." He turned to look at her. She was standing at the window, arms crossed, looking out at the cattle coming in from the south pasture for the evening. "What do you mean?" he said. "I meant to wait until you had your feet under you," she said. "But now that you're—" She stopped. Started again. "The ranch is stable. You know where everything is now. I think the transition can be managed without too much trouble." She said it briskly, the way she said things when she was keeping something at a distance. "You'll probably want to—" "Clara. Make some changes anyway. I know the East Quarter doesn't drain well, but if you run a sub—" "Clara." She stopped talking. She didn't turn around. "Where exactly in Garrison were you planning to go?" he said. A pause. "I have some money saved, enough to start over." "Start over where?" "I haven't decided." He was quiet for a long moment. He could see her reflection faint in the window glass, her expression arranged into the particular careful neutrality he recognized now, the face she made when something mattered and she didn't want it to show. "You've been here 2 years and 4 months, he said. "Yes." "And in that time you fixed the barn roof, rebuilt the herd, kept the mortgage current, put a stone on Margaret's grave, and kept this whole operation alive through 2 Montana winters." She said nothing. "And your plan," he said, "was always to leave." "Yes." "Because you felt like you'd paid the debt back." A long pause. "That's right." "And you don't think," he said carefully, "that there's anything else here worth—" "Mr. Mercer." She turned around then. Her expression was controlled, but her hands were clasped in front of her and she was holding them tight. "I came here to do a thing that needed doing. I've done it. You're back. The ranch is yours. This is—" She looked around the kitchen. "This was always supposed to be yours." "It's yours too," he said. "It's not." "It could be." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the cattle had settled and the wind had died, and it was the particular stillness of a mountain evening when the light is going gold and everything stops for a moment. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I need you to understand that. I didn't come here to be paid back." "I know that," he said. "I figured that out about 3 days after I got here." He stood up from the table. "But that's not what I'm talking about." She looked at him with those steady eyes of hers, and for once he couldn't quite read what was in them. "I'm talking," he said, "about what happens to this ranch if you leave. And I'm talking about the fact that you're better at running it than I am right now, and probably will be for the next year at least while I find my footing again." He stopped. "And I'm talking about the fact that this kitchen feels like a kitchen when you're in it, and an empty room when you're not." She said nothing, but she unclasped her hands. "Stay," he said. "Not for the debt. Not for anything you owe me. Stay because we can build something here that neither of us can build alone." The light was going. The last of the October sun was coming through the kitchen window at a low angle, cutting across the table between them. Clara Whitlock looked at him for a long time. "I'll think about it," she said, and turned back to the window. Outside, the last of the cattle settled into the south pasture, and the smoke from the chimney rose straight up into a still Montana sky. And the Mercer Ranch stood quiet and whole in the dying light of an October afternoon, waiting, the way a thing that has survived a great deal of hardship waits, for whatever would come next. She did think about it. 3 days, by Wade's count. 3 days of working alongside him, as though the conversation hadn't happened, or hadn't happened in quite the way it had. Getting up before dawn, doing the barn, rotating the cattle, managing the books in the evening with the same focused efficiency she brought to everything. She didn't avoid him. She didn't make it strange. She simply set the question aside the way you'd set a heavy thing down on a shelf while you figured out whether you had room for it. On the fourth morning, he came in from the well and found her at the table with her coffee and the mortgage ledger open in front of her, not reading it, just sitting with it. She looked up when he came in. "Equal partnership means equal say," she said. He set the water bucket down. "Yes. If I think something should be done a certain way and you think it should be done another way, we talk it through. Neither of us just decides." "Agreed. And if I leave—" She stopped, started again. "If at some point it makes sense for the arrangement to end, we end it without it becoming a problem." He looked at her. "You mean if one of us wants out?" "Yes." "Agreed," he said again. She looked at the ledger, looked back at him. "All right," she said, and closed the ledger and finished her coffee and went back out to the barn. That was how it was decided. No ceremony, no handshakes, just two people arriving at a practical conclusion about an impractical situation, in a kitchen that still smelled like the morning's cornbread, in a Montana October that was already threatening to turn cold. Wade went to the bank on Monday. Crane received him with the professional pleasantness of a man making calculations, and Wade put it to him plainly. He wanted Clara Whitlock added to the mortgage agreement as an equal party. Crane said that was unusual. Wade said most things worth doing were. Crane looked at the account, which was current, not one payment behind, maintained by a woman alone through 2 complete cycles of Montana seasons, and decided that unusual was something he could accommodate. The papers were drawn up on Wednesday. Clara came to town to sign them, and she signed them the way she did most things, quickly and without making anything of it. But Wade noticed she kept the copy of the document folded in her coat pocket the whole ride back instead of putting it in the saddlebag. He didn't mention it. The town, as Carl Hobart had predicted, had opinions. Not all of them were unfriendly. There was a contingent, mostly the women who'd watched Clara manage that ranch alone for 2 years, who'd seen her drive cattle single-handed through a spring flood, who'd bought her eggs when she had surplus and sold her flour when she ran short, who received the news of the arrangement with something approaching approval. Mabel Hobart told her husband it was the most sensible thing to come out of the Mercer place in 3 years. Her husband said he couldn't argue with that, but there were others. The first sign of it was at Garrison's General Store, where a man named Grover Tillis, who ran cattle on the north end of the county and considered himself the sort of man whose opinion shaped things, was holding court near the stove when Wade came in for fencing supplies. Tillis was a wide man with small eyes and the particular confidence of someone who'd never had to question whether the room was listening. "Mercer," he said, loud enough for the whole store to follow. "Heard you made that widow woman a partner." "Word travels," Wade said. "Unusual arrangement," Tillis said. "So I've been told." Tillis looked at his companions, 2 men whose names Wade knew, both of them Tillis's people in some financial arrangement or another. "Man goes missing 3 years, comes back, finds a woman's been running his place, and just—" he spread his hands. "Signs it over half and half." "I didn't sign it over," Wade said. He was examining a roll of wire and keeping his voice even. "She earned it. There's a difference. Some people might say a woman alone on a man's property for 2 years is—" "I wouldn't finish that sentence," Wade said. He looked up from the wire then. "Not in a way that requires me to respond to it." Tillis held his gaze for a moment, made the calculation, and let it go. But he didn't drop the expression, and he didn't drop the topic, and over the following weeks Wade heard various versions of the same thing coming back to him through the particular informal network by which information moves through small frontier communities. The banker thought it was a strange arrangement. The Presbytery deacon thought it was a strange arrangement. 3 different men who wanted Clara Whitlock's situation resolved in a more conventional direction, meaning one that involved one of them, thought it was a very strange arrangement indeed. Clara heard it too and said nothing about it, which Wade had come to understand was not the same as not caring. She just put things in a category and dealt with them there, privately, without advertising the process. The one time he brought it up directly, she said, "People talked when I arrived and nothing happened. They'll talk now and nothing will happen." She was mending a bridle at the kitchen table. "The mortgage either gets paid or it doesn't. That's what matters." "It bothers you," he said. She kept her eyes on the bridle. "Some of it does." A pause. "The part about Thomas bothers me." Her late husband. "People invent reasons for things. Some of them have decided Thomas was—" She stopped. "That I came here for a reason that has to do with propriety and not with debt. And I can't—" She set the bridle down. "You can't argue people out of a story they've already decided to believe. You just have to outlast it." He thought about that. "How do you outlast it?" "Same way you outlast everything out here," she said. "You keep working." And she picked up the bridle and went back to work. The winter came hard that year, which was saying something given the standards of that particular region. It announced itself in November with a week of flat gray sky, and then arrived in earnest the third week of the month with a storm that put 2 feet of snow on the ground in 36 hours. Wade had been watching the sky for a week, and they'd gotten the cattle into the lower pasture shelter, brought in enough hay to cover 3 months, checked every pipe and every piece of equipment that would be miserable to deal with frozen. None of which prevented the water pump handle from snapping off in Wade's hand on the second morning of the storm. He came back inside holding the broken handle and set it on the table without a word, and Clara looked at it for a moment and said, "How bad?" "Need to heat the pipe before we try to replace it or we'll crack it. I've got rags. I've got the coal oil." They spent the better part of the morning out there, working in shifts because the wind chill made staying outside for more than 15 minutes genuinely dangerous. One of them heating the wrapped pipe while the other thawed out by the stove, then switching. Clara's hands were better than his at the detail work, smaller and more precise, and she was the one who got the new handle seated correctly while Wade held the pipe steady. He had his back to the wind and she was leaning in close to see what she was doing, and at one point her shoulder was against his arm, and neither of them moved away from it. They fixed the pump. They did not say anything about the shoulder situation. They went back inside. That was the winter in small compass, cold, practical, shoulder-to-shoulder work, and what passed between them unspoken in the gaps. The thing about sharing a small house through a Montana winter with another person is that you learn things about them that normal acquaintance doesn't reveal. You learn what hour they wake up. You learn the sounds they make when they're in a bad mood versus tired versus genuinely worried. You learn that Clara Whitlock woke at 4:30 every morning, regardless of when she went to sleep, and that she made coffee before she did anything else, and that she drank it standing at the kitchen window looking east. Not at anything in particular, just at the dark and then the gray, and then whatever the morning turned out to be. He started getting up at 4:32. He told himself it was because there was work to do, which was true, but not the complete truth. They developed habits without deciding to. She took the horses, he took the cattle. He cooked Sunday dinners, she cooked everything else because she was better at it, and they both knew it. She kept the financial records because she had a better head for figures. He handled the equipment repairs because she'd proven she could do them, but it was grinding work, and it was fair to distribute grinding work between two people. They argued for the first time in December about the cattle rotation. It wasn't a dramatic argument. There were no raised voices, but it had some heat in it. He thought moving the herd to the east quarter for the latter part of winter would give the south pasture time to recover. She thought the east quarter drainage was too uncertain and they'd lose animals to wet hoof if they had a warm spell in February. He said she was overcautious. She said he hadn't been there for 2 winters and he was missing some information. That landed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right, east quarter stays empty." "Thank you," she said. "You could have just said you had more experience with it." "I did say that." "You said it like an accusation." She looked at him. "I didn't mean it like one." "I know." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm still—" He stopped. "It's still a little difficult, hearing about things that happened here when I wasn't here." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry." It wasn't the kind of sorry that's an ending. It was the kind that opens a door. They talked, carefully, for the first time, about what those 2 years had actually been like for each of them. Him in the mountains, her on the ranch, the way time passes differently when you're surviving versus when you're waiting. He told her about the winter of '81 from his side, The party of 7 reduced to 2, making camp in a hollow under a fallen tree for 11 days, eating what they had and then what they could melt out of the snow. She told him about the same winter from hers, the 6-week snowfall, the 4 dead cattle, the going to bed when it got dark. They sat up late doing this and the fire burned down, and neither of them noticed it getting cold until their breath started showing. "I thought about you," she said, which stopped him cold. "Not," she caught herself. "I mean, I thought about whether you were alive. Some nights I'd work out the timing and try to figure where you might be." "What did you decide?" "I went back and forth." She looked at the dead fire. "Some nights I was sure you were dead, and the whole thing I was doing was just—" She shook her head. "And some nights I was sure you weren't, and I'd get up and go back to work. And this was before you knew for certain. Long before." He thought about that. A woman alone in a winter house, calculating whether a stranger she'd never met was still alive in a mountain range she'd never seen, and getting up and going back to work regardless. "Why?" he said, not challenging, genuinely asking. She looked at him for a long moment. "Because it didn't change what needed to be done," she said. "That's all." He wasn't sure that was all, but he didn't push it. In January, a man named Roy Phelps rode up to the ranch and offered to buy it. He was a property man out of Helena, well-dressed in a way that was calibrated to impress without quite fitting the country he was operating in, and he sat his horse in the yard and explained that he represented a group of investors who were acquiring land in the valley for a consolidated grazing operation. He named a price that was fair in the abstract and completely beside the point. Wade said they weren't selling. Phelps smiled the smile of a man who expects to be told no the first time. "I understand you've got some financial pressures on the mortgage." "The mortgage is current," Wade said. "Yes, but the next year's payment is what?" A slight shift in Phelps' expression. He recalculated. "I'm just saying that a fair offer in hand is worth considering before the spring." "We've considered it," Clara said from the porch. She had come out while Phelps was talking, drying her hands on a cloth. "No, thank you." Phelps looked at her, then at Wade, then at her again, putting together the arrangement in his mind. "Perhaps we could discuss—" The lady said no, Wade said. "I'd take that as the final word." Phelps left with his smile reduced by about 30%. That evening, Claire put the ledger on the table, and they went through the next year's numbers carefully, the way people do when someone has just reminded them how close the margins are. The spring payment was manageable if the cattle prices held. If they didn't hold, it would be tight. If it was a bad spring on top of that, it would be very tight. "We need a good calf crop," Clara said. "We need the east pasture drainage fixed before spring," Wade said. "I know. I've been putting it off because the materials—" "I know why you put it off." He looked at the numbers. "We spend the money and do it right. That cuts into the spring payment fund. And bad drainage cuts into the calf crop, which cuts into everything else." She tapped the page with her pencil. Did the math again. "We'd have about $30 margin on the spring payment." $30? Yes. He looked at that number. $30 between the ranch and a missed payment, which would begin the whole cascade they'd been holding off. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They ordered the drainage materials the following week. It was not a comfortable thing to spend money they didn't have a lot of, but it was the right call, and they both knew it. What Wade noticed was how easy the decision had been once they got through the numbers. Not easy because the money was there, but easy because there was no argument about what mattered. They were pointed in the same direction. He thought about that later, in the particular way you think about things when you're doing work that doesn't require much thought. Mending fence in the January cold, moving slowly enough that his hands didn't go completely numb. Two people pointed in the same direction. Margaret had been pointed in a direction too, but it hadn't always been the same one as his, and they'd loved each other well and argued often and made it work because they were both stubborn enough to outlast their disagreements. He missed her with the constant low ache of something permanently missing, the way you miss a tooth. Not agony, just always there, always the awareness of the absence. Clara was something different. Not a replacement. He was sure enough of himself to know that replacement was not what this was. But something was building in that house through that winter that he didn't have an easy word for. Something that had less to do with the debt and the ranch and the partnership and more to do with 4:30 in the morning and the kitchen window, and the way she'd leaned her shoulder against his arm in the cold, and neither of them had moved. He was not going to say anything about it. Not yet. They were still new to each other, still learning each other's wrong moods and wrong turns. There was too much at stake in the ranch and the partnership to complicate it with something neither of them was sure of. But he was aware of it, and watching her sometimes, at the table, doing the books, or in the barn, working with a focused attention that didn't spare much for whatever else was in the room, he thought she might be aware of it too. February was the worst month, as February tends to be. The storm that hit the second week of the month wasn't as long as the great one in November, but it was meaner, with the kind of cold that gets into the walls of a house and sits there. They lost one calf, born too early in the cold, didn't take, and Clara was the one who'd been up with it, and she came in from the barn in the gray morning looking worn out in a way that was more than tired. "I'm sorry," Wade said. "It happens," she said. "I know, but I'm still sorry." She sat at the table and he poured coffee without asking and set it in front of her. She wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at nothing for a while. "It's always the ones you tried hardest with," she said. He sat down across from her. "Yeah. Thomas was like that." She said it quietly, not looking up. "Sick for 3 weeks. I tried everything She stopped. "He died anyway." It was the most she'd said about Thomas since she'd first told Wade the basic facts. He didn't say anything, just sat with her in the cold kitchen with the storm grinding against the walls, because sometimes sitting is what there is. After a while, she finished the coffee and stood up. "I'm going to sleep for 2 hours," she said. "Then I'm going to check on the south herd." "I'll check the south herd," he said. "Sleep as long as you need." She looked at him. Then she said, "Thank you, Wade," and went to her room. He sat alone in the kitchen for a few minutes after she was gone. Outside, the storm was making the kind of sounds that a storm makes when it has more to say. The walls held. The fire held. And somewhere south of the house, the herd was standing in the shelter he and Clara had built together, waiting out the cold the same way the two of them were. Not comfortably, not without cost, but stubbornly and side by side. He pulled on his coat and went out to check on the cattle. Spring came the way it always does in that country. Not gradually, not kindly, but all at once, and with attitude. The snow in the low pastures went out in a week of warm rain that turned every flat piece of ground into a problem. The creek ran high and brown and fast, taking out a section of the east fence that Wade had known was marginal, and had been meaning to get to before the thaw and hadn't quite managed. He and Clara spent 3 days in mud up to their boot tops resetting posts in ground that didn't want to hold them, working in the cold rain with the particular grim focus of people who cannot afford to stop and complain about what they're doing. The drainage work they'd spent the winter's margin on proved itself that March. The East Quarter handled the runoff better than it ever had, and the calf count that spring was 23. Not a record, but solid, the kind of number that makes the next mortgage payment feel like a real thing instead of a hope. Clara wrote the figures in the ledger with the careful handwriting she used for numbers that mattered and didn't say anything, but Wade saw her press her lips together in a way that meant she was holding something back, and he understood it to be relief. 23, he said. 23, she said. That's a good spring. It's a better spring than the last two. She set the pencil down. I'll take it. They made the payment with $11 to spare instead of $30, because a post-hole digger had cracked and needed replacing, and that was $11 they hadn't planned for. $11 margin. Wade thought about Roy Phelps and his Helena investors, and the polished way he'd sat his horse in the yard and offered them a clean exit, and felt something settle in his chest that was not quite satisfaction, but was close to it. The summer that followed was the kind that frontier summers tend to be when they decide not to be cruel. Hot and dry in July, which stressed the pastures but not past managing, a good hay crop in the lower field, cattle that put on weight the way they were supposed to. Wade got his legs back fully under him. He'd spent the winter rebuilding his strength, not just the physical condition, which came back faster than he expected, but the particular confidence of a man who knows his own land. He learned what Clara had changed, understood why she'd changed it, and found that most of it he wouldn't have done differently himself, and a few things he would have, and they argued about those things with the productive friction of two people who are trying to get to the right answer rather than win. She was, he concluded, better than him at the financial side, better at planning ahead, better at holding a number in her head and running scenarios against it. He was better at the physical management of the herd, reading the animals, knowing when something was off before it became a problem, handling the unpredictable situations that no amount of planning could account for. They stopped having to say which of them was going to handle what. They just knew. There were things they didn't talk about. He was still sleeping in his old room, she in what had been the guest room at the back of the house, and the arrangement was functional and appropriate, and increasingly, a fact that occupied a certain amount of space in his thinking without him doing anything about it. She was Clara Whitlock, and she was his partner in the most literal sense, and she had cried exactly once in his presence, briefly, in February, after the calf died, and she didn't know he could see her through the barn door. And she'd stopped immediately when she noticed him and never mentioned it, which told him a great deal about how she handled things and how much space she kept around herself. He was not without his own walls, he knew that. The mountains had added some, and the grief for Margaret had added others before that. He was a man who communicated better through action than speech, which was both useful on a ranch and occasionally maddening as a human quality. They managed. That was the honest word for what they did through that first year and into the second. They managed each other, and the land, and the money, and the neighbors' opinions, and the memory of the people they'd lost, with varying degrees of success and occasional significant failure. The failure that almost broke everything came in the fall of the second year. His name was Grover Tillis, and he had not dropped the topic. Wade had known it was still alive. You could feel it in the way Tillis operated in Garrison, the way he positioned himself at the bank, always talking to Crane when Wade came in, always with the particular body language of a man who has been having a conversation that he wants you to know about. Tillis ran the largest cattle operation in the northern end of the county, and he'd been making quiet moves to expand south for 2 seasons, and the Mercer Ranch sat in the middle of the path those moves wanted to take. The first real sign of it was when Crane called Wade in for a meeting in September. He sat across the banker's desk in the small, wood-paneled office, and Crane arranged his papers with the care of a man who has something to say that he'd rather not be the one to say. "The bank has been reviewing the county portfolio," Crane said. "All right," Wade said. "There are some concerns about certain loan structures. Is the Mercer mortgage current?" "Yes, but is there a payment we've missed? Any payment since Clara Whitlock took over the account?" Crane paused. "No." "Then what are we talking about?" Crane set his papers down. He was, at his core, a man who had chosen banking because he preferred clear transactions to complicated ones, and the look on his face was the look of someone who has been asked to participate in a transaction that is neither clear nor clean. The bank board has been advised that the current ownership structure of the Mercer property may not be legally sound. There's a question about whether a partnership agreement entered into without— "Stop." Wade kept his voice level. "Who told the board that?" Crane said nothing, which was answer enough. Wade stood up. "The partnership is legal. The paperwork is in order. You drew it up yourself." He picked up his hat. "If the bank decides there's a problem with legal paperwork that the bank itself drew up, that will be a very interesting conversation to have in a public setting." He walked out. He rode home faster than he should have, which meant Biscuit was in a mood by the time they got back to the ranch, and Wade had to spend 10 minutes walking him before he could put him up, which did not improve Wade's mood. Clara was in the kitchen when he came in. She read his face in the way she'd gotten good at over 2 years of close quarters. "What happened?" she said. Not a question. He told her. All of it, including the part where Crane had declined to name Tillis, which was the part she needed to hear. She listened without interrupting, which was her way. When he finished, she sat with it for a moment. "He's trying to get the bank to challenge the partnership," she said. "That's what it looks like." "If they decide the partnership is invalid, what happens to the mortgage?" "It reverts to my name only." Wade sat down. "And then it becomes a question of whether I can carry it alone, which— You can't," she said. Not unkindly, just true. "Not at current cattle prices with the payment structure we have." "No." She was quiet. Wade had seen her quiet in various ways. The productive quiet of someone thinking, the careful quiet of someone keeping something back, the exhausted quiet of February mornings. This was a different kind. This was the quiet of someone reckoning with something they thought they'd outrun. "He wants the land," she said. He's always wanted the land. And if the partnership is dissolved and you can't carry the mortgage, he buys it at foreclosure and we're both out. Wade looked at his hands. That's the play. Clara stood up and went to the window. The same window she'd been standing at the night he'd asked her to stay. The one that looked out over the south pasture, over the cattle and the fence line, and the land they'd been holding together by the smallest margins for 2 years. We need a lawyer, she said. Lawyers cost money. I know what lawyers cost. She turned around. We need one anyway. Tillis is working through the bank because it's cleaner than working directly. But if we put the partnership documents in front of a real lawyer and the bank knows we've done it, Crane is going to have a hard time continuing to pretend there's a legitimate question. She was right. He knew she was right before she finished the sentence. It'll take most of what we have. Yes. The spring payment will be tight. She crossed her arms. It'll be tight, or it won't be. We can't let him take the legal angle without responding to it. He looked at her. She was standing with her back straight and her jaw set in the particular expression she wore when she'd already made up her mind and was stating a position rather than proposing one. You've thought about this before, he said. She hesitated. I thought something like this might happen, she said. When Phelps came last winter, people don't send a property man and accept the first no. They look for another way. You didn't say anything. I didn't want to worry you over something that might not happen. She looked at him steadily. I should have said something. I'm sorry. He sat with that. She was right that she should have said something, and she was right to apologize, and he wasn't sure he'd have handled it any differently in her position. They were still learning which things to keep to themselves and which things to put on the table, and this was the place where keeping something private had nearly turned into a serious problem. We talk about things like this, he said, going forward. Yes, she said, going forward. They rode to Garrison the next morning and sat in the office of a lawyer named Francis Dempsey, who was 60 years old and had the pleasantly rumpled quality of a man who had been practicing law on the frontier long enough that very little surprised him. He read the partnership documents with the thoroughness of someone who was not going to have an opinion until he'd read everything twice, and then he set the papers down and looked at them over his spectacles. Solid, he said. The bank seems to think otherwise, Wade said. The bank drew these up. The bank's own attorney signed off on them. Dempsey tapped the papers. If they argue the documents are invalid, they're arguing their own work is invalid. That's not a case. That's a headache. He looked at Clara. You're Mrs. Whitlock. Yes. You've been operating as equal partner for, he checked, 22 months. Yes. Paying the mortgage during that time, keeping records, making capital improvements. He made a small sound that might have been amusement. There's a legal doctrine called ratification. When one party behaves consistently with the terms of an agreement over a significant period, that behavior ratifies the agreement regardless of technical questions about the original execution. The bank has been cashing your payments for 22 months. They've ratified this partnership 6 ways from Sunday. Wade looked at Clara. She was looking at Dempsey with the careful expression of someone who is not yet prepared to be relieved. So they can't challenge it, she said. They can try. Courts are unpredictable and lawyers are expensive and time is a cost. Dempsey folded his hands. But if I write a letter to Mr. Crane laying out those documents and that doctrine and the clear record of payment, and if I make it apparent that any legal challenge will become a matter of public record in this county. He let that sit. My experience is that banks choose the clean path when the clean path is available. The letter cost them $40. It was $40 they had and spent deliberately, which was not the same as having it easily. Crane received the letter on a Thursday. On the following Monday, he sent word that the bank considered the Mercer Partnership Agreement to be in good standing. No further reference was made to the board's concerns. Tillis was not mentioned by name in any of it. He didn't have to be. It's not over, Wade told Clara the evening after Crane's message arrived. I know, she said. He'll try something else. Probably not through the bank again. That avenue's closed. He thought about it. Landmen operate different ways. He might try to buy out one of the neighboring parcels and cut our water access on the east side. Hobart would never sell to Tillis. No, but the Durr place might. The Durr property sat east of Hobart's, and old Ben Dare had been in poor health for 2 seasons. If Tillis gets the Durr land, he controls the Upper Creek access. Clara was quiet for a moment. What do we do about that? Nothing we can do until it happens. Wade looked at the fire. We watch and we stay current on the mortgage and we keep the cattle in good condition and we make sure we're not in a position where any single thing going wrong can finish us. That's what we've been doing. That's what we keep doing. He looked at her. I'm not saying it's elegant. Nothing about any of this is elegant, she said. He almost smiled. No. She got up to bank the fire for the night, and as she straightened up from the hearth, she said, without turning around, "Thank you for not giving me the 'we'll be fine' speech." Have I ever given you that speech? No. She turned around then, and there was something in her face that was quieter and more open than usual. Not calculated openness, but the kind that slips through when you're tired and your guard comes down an inch. That's one of the things She stopped. That's one of the things that helps. She went to bed. He sat by the dying fire for a while. He'd been in this country long enough to know that the land doesn't owe you anything. It doesn't reward goodness or punish cruelty with any consistency you could rely on. The creek floods regardless of whether you've been a decent person. The frost comes when it comes. What you do is build structures, physical and otherwise, that give you a fighting chance when the things you can't control decide to move against you. What he and Clara had built, in 2 years of difficult work and careful choices and occasional bad arguments, and at least one conversation by a dying fire that had come closer to something than either of them had put into words, all of it was structure. All of it was the difference between having a chance and not having one. Tillis would try again. Wade was sure of that. A man like Tillis didn't take 2 rejections and adjust his ambitions. He recalibrated and waited and found the angle that hadn't been covered yet. The angle came in October, and it was worse than Wade had expected. Ben Durr died in the 2nd week of the month. Wade heard it from Carl Hobart at the feed store, and his first thought was for Ben's family, who had a hard road now, and his second thought was for the Durr property and what happened to it. What happened to it, he found out 4 days later, was that Durr's son Ned, who had spent the better part of 10 years making clear he wanted nothing to do with frontier ranching and had been living in Billings doing something with freight ledgers, had sold it. Quickly, at a price that suggested he'd accepted the first offer. The buyer was a land trust out of Helena called the Consolidated Valley Partnership. It took Dempsey one afternoon to determine who held the primary interest in the Consolidated Valley Partnership. Tillis had the Durr property, which meant he had the Upper Creek, which meant that in a dry summer, and this country had dry summers with regularity, he controlled whether the east quarter of the Mercer Ranch got adequate water. Wade came home and sat at the table and told Clara what Dempsey had found and watched her face go through several things in quick succession. Surprise, because even expecting another move, she hadn't expected this one quite yet. Calculation, because that was her reflex when something threatened the ranch. And then, underneath both of those, something harder. A tired, clear-eyed anger that he hadn't seen on her face before. He can't divert the creek, she said. That's water rights law. He can't divert it, but he can dam the upper section on his property. Slow the flow, especially in July and August when the snow melt's done. She looked at him. How much does that hurt us? Depends on the summer. He laid it out plainly because she deserved plainly. A normal summer, we manage. A dry summer, the east quarter loses enough that we'd have to reduce the herd or sell early before they've put on weight. Either way, we lose money. He paused. 2 dry summers in a row, and we can't make the payment. She sat with that. The fire had been going when he came in, and it was warm in the kitchen, and the smell of the evening meal she'd been making before he arrived, a pot of something that had been going all afternoon, filled the room, and all of it was so familiar and so hard-won and so genuinely theirs that the thought of Tillis sitting in some office in Helena, having determined that patience and paperwork would do what bluntness hadn't, it made something move in Wade's chest that was not a feeling he was accustomed to. I'm not letting him take this place, he said. His voice was quiet, but Clara looked up at him sharply, because she'd known him long enough to understand that the quiet ones were the ones he meant. Neither am I, she said. They looked at each other across the table in that warm kitchen with the fire and the slow smell of supper. 2 people who had separately decided, at some point in the last 2 years, that the thing they were building together mattered enough to fight for, past the point where a reasonable person would calculate the odds and walk away. Then we figure it out, Wade said. Clara nodded once. Then we figure it out. Outside, the October wind was picking up, coming down off the mountains cold and sure of itself, the way it always did when the season turned. The fire held, the walls held, and the Mercer Ranch stood in the dark at the edge of the valley with its repaired fences and its 30 cattle and its 2 people who were, for reasons neither of them had entirely examined yet, not going anywhere. Figuring it out took most of that winter. The first thing Wade did was ride the Upper Creek line from the Mercer property boundary all the way to where it crossed into the Dare land, Tillis's land now, though it would take time before that felt real, and map it on paper the way Dempsey had shown him, marking the elevations and the natural collection points, and the places where a structure could be built that would slow the flow without technically constituting a full diversion. Water law on the frontier was complicated in the way that all law is complicated when the thing it governs is essential to survival. You could not take another man's water. What you could do occupied a significant gray area that lawyers had been arguing about for decades. He brought the map to Dempsey on a Thursday in November with the mud still on his boots from the creek walk, and Dempsey spread it on his desk and looked at it with the careful attention of a man who understood that geography was argument. "Here," Wade said, putting his finger on a bend in the Upper Creek about 60 yards inside the Dare boundary. "Natural formation. He dams there. It reduces the flow to our east quarter by maybe a third in a normal year, more in a dry one. Has he filed any construction permits? Not that I've found. Then he's either waiting or he's planning to move without filing." Dempsey traced the creek line with one finger. "If he moves without filing, that's a violation we can bring to the Territorial Water Board, but that only helps us after the damage is done." "I want to get ahead of it." "Then you need your own water documentation." Dempsey looked up. "File your historical usage rights with the Territorial Office. Every acre you irrigate from that creek, every season you've been doing it, documented formally. It won't stop him from building, but it puts you first in line legally when the fight comes." He paused. "And it will come." "I know that. The filing costs money. Everything costs money." Wade picked up his hat. "Do it." He rode home and told Clara, who listened and then went to the ledger without a word and came back 2 minutes later with the number they had available after the fall payment. It was not comfortable. It was enough. "Do it," she said, which was the same thing he'd said to Dempsey, and he noticed that and felt something that he didn't examine too closely. The water rights documentation was filed with the Territorial Office in December, which required a trip to the county seat that took 3 days and cost Wade a bad night in a boarding house with a broken window, and Clara managing the ranch alone in early winter cold, which she did without apparent difficulty because she had been doing exactly that for 2 years before he came back and hadn't forgotten how. When he returned, she had the east fence repaired, a section he'd been putting off, and a detailed accounting of what it had cost in materials and labor hours, the labor hours being her own, and therefore listed at 0 in the ledger but noted in the margin in her careful handwriting, because she thought the actual work should be recorded somewhere, even if they weren't paying themselves for it. He looked at that margin note for a moment. "You don't have to track your own hours," he said. "Somebody should know what the work actually costs." She didn't look up from what she was doing. "Even if we can't afford to charge for it." He didn't argue. She was right, and it was also characteristic of her in a way he'd come to recognize as one of her fixed qualities, the need to make the true account, regardless of whether the true account was useful or comfortable. She kept the real numbers. She wrote the margin notes. She looked at what things actually cost and didn't pretend otherwise. January was cold and quiet, and in some ways the most functional month they'd had. They'd settled into each other thoroughly enough by then that the house didn't feel provisional anymore. It felt inhabited in the way that a place does when 2 people have genuinely made it theirs, not decorated, not arranged for appearance, but worn in by use, by the particular pattern of 2 people moving through the same space and accommodating each other's rhythms without having to think about it. He knew she took her coffee to the window every morning. She knew he went to check on Biscuit last thing every night regardless of whether there was any practical reason to. He knew she had trouble sleeping when the wind came from the north, which it did most of January, and that she'd get up around 2 in the morning and he'd hear her in the kitchen. He didn't get up too. He figured she knew it was available if she wanted company, and she'd come to the doorway if she did. She never did, which meant she needed the alone time, and he respected that. What he didn't know, what he was becoming increasingly aware that he didn't know, was what she wanted from her life now that the immediate crisis had stabilized into a chronic one. He knew what she'd wanted when she came to the Mercer Ranch, to repay a debt. He knew what she'd wanted during the partnership's early months, to make the ranch work. But the ranch was working, in the difficult and marginal way that working meant in that country, and the debt was long past repaid by any accounting that mattered. And the question of what Clara Whitlock wanted going forward was one that sat in the back of his mind with increasing weight. He didn't ask. He wasn't sure he had the right to ask, and he wasn't sure he was ready for the answer, and he told himself there was work to do, and that was true, and it was also convenient. Tillis made his move in March. He didn't build a dam. He was smarter than that, or his lawyers were. What he did instead was file a challenge to the Mercer water rights documentation, arguing that the historical usage records Wade had submitted were incomplete and that the creek's flow allocation across the valley should be recalculated based on land mass rather than historical use. It was a legal argument designed to take 2 years and cost significant money to resolve, during which time the uncertainty itself would be the weapon. Dempsey read the filing and looked at Wade over his spectacles with the expression of a man who is not surprised but is nonetheless annoyed. He's not wrong that the allocation rules are contested. There's been ongoing argument at the territorial level for years. He set the papers down. What he's doing is using the existing ambiguity to create expense and uncertainty. Make it cost you enough and you sell. Or you miss a payment and the bank moves. What do? We respond to the filing, which costs money. We make it clear we intend to contest it fully, which signals that this won't be the cheap exercise he may be hoping for. Dempsey thought for a moment. And we find out whether any of his other neighbors have been having similar trouble. Because a man who tries this once has usually tried it before. That was the piece Wade brought home that changed the direction. He didn't pursue it immediately. He sat on it through March while they lambed and managed a late-season cold snap that threatened the new calves and required 3 days of essentially no sleep, working in shifts the way they did for the bad stretches, Clara taking midnight to 4, Wade taking 4 to 8, and then they'd overlap for the morning hours when the work was heaviest. By the time the cold snap broke, they'd saved 21 of 23 calves, lost 2 that were never going to make it regardless, and both of them were operating on the hollow efficiency of the severely sleep-deprived. The morning after the temperature came back up, Clara sat down at the kitchen table and put her head in her hands for about 30 seconds. Not crying, just depleted, and then straightened up and pushed her hair back and said, "Coffee." "Already made," Wade said. She looked at the mug in front of her that she hadn't noticed, picked it up. "I didn't even see that. You're not quite awake yet." "I haven't been quite awake since Tuesday." She drank. 21. 21. That's good. She said it like she was reminding herself. "That's a good number." "It's a good number," he agreed. They sat in the particular silence of 2 people who are too tired to fill it and don't need to. Outside, the March sun was doing its best with the remains of the cold snap, and the cattle were moving in the south pasture with the purposeful energy of animals that had come through something hard and knew the grass was going to come back. In April, Wade went to see the Kimball family. Harlan Kimball ran a medium-sized spread about 12 miles north and slightly west of the Mercer land, on the other side of a low ridge that put them in a different creek watershed, which was, as it turned out, exactly relevant. Because Harlan Kimball's water access had been in dispute for 3 years, and the entity disputing it, Wade discovered after an afternoon of careful conversation in Kimball's kitchen, was the Consolidated Valley Partnership, Tillis. Same play, different property. "He tried to buy us out 2 years ago," Harlan said. He was a wide-shouldered man in his 60s with a gray beard and the look of someone who had argued about water rights before. "We said no. Next spring he filed on the creek allocation, and we've been in the legal back and forth since." "Costing you money," Wade said. "Costing me money I don't have to spare." Harlan looked at his wife, Ada, who was sitting at the end of the table with her arms folded and an expression that said she had opinions about Grover Tillis that were not suitable for polite company. "What's he done to your place?" Wade told him. Harlan listened with the attention of a man who recognizes a pattern. When Wade finished, Harlan looked at Ada again and then looked back. "How many other properties you reckon he's doing this to?" Harlan said. "That's what I came to find out." They spent the rest of the afternoon going through names. The Durr sale, the Braxton place on the South Fork that had sold quietly the previous fall, 2 other operations in the Upper Valley that had been in legal trouble over water and had resolved that trouble by selling. When they laid it out in order, it was clear enough. Tillis was acquiring the valley systematically, using legal pressure and financial attrition to push out anyone who couldn't afford the cost of resisting. Dempsey says we need to contest the filing, Wade said. But if we're contesting separately, we're each paying our own legal costs and he's dividing us. Harlan caught where this was going. You're talking about contesting together. Same filing, same challenge. Split the legal costs. And if there are other properties he's done this to, we find them and they join us. Wade looked at him. Tillis is counting on us being isolated. He moves on one property at a time because fighting one rancher is easier than fighting 5. Harlan was quiet for a moment. What does Dempsey think? I haven't told Dempsey yet. I wanted to know if you were willing first. Harlan looked at his wife. Ada unfolded her arms. Tell me, she said to Wade, does the Mercer Ranch have a woman partner who spent 2 years keeping it alive alone? Wade blinked. Word travels. I make it my business to know who my neighbors are. She looked at Harlan. If she's willing to fight Tillis, we're willing to fight alongside her. She looked back at Wade. Yes? Harlan nodded slowly. Yes. Wade rode home with something that felt, cautiously, like momentum. He found Clara in the barn, which was where she was most evenings before supper, doing the last check on the horses. He told her about Kimball, about the pattern, about the idea of a joint legal challenge. She listened the way she listened to things that mattered, completely still, not filling the pauses. When he finished, she said, How many properties do you think he's pressured? 5 that I can identify, maybe more. And how many of them would join a joint contest? I don't know yet. Kimball for certain. The others? He shook his head. Some of them have already sold. But the ones that are still holding on, that are still in the legal fight, they're paying Tillis's price every month in lawyers' fees. If we can split that 5 ways instead of 1, and if Dempsey can handle the consolidated case, I'll ask him. She was quiet for a moment. There's a risk, she said. If this becomes a public fight, if we're organizing other ranchers against Tillis openly, he escalates. He has more resources than we do. He can make it expensive in ways we haven't anticipated. I know that. And you want to do it anyway. He doesn't stop, Wade said. He's not going to run out of angles. We can keep responding to each thing he tries, and it costs us, and eventually one of them lands at the wrong moment, and we're done. He looked at her. Or we make it expensive enough for him that it's not worth it. She looked at him for a long moment. A man like Tillis doesn't get where he is by deciding things aren't worth it. No. But he got where he is by picking fights he can win cheaply. Wade held her gaze. We make it expensive. We make it public. We make it so that everyone in this county knows what he's doing and who he's doing it to. He paused. People around here know what it means when a small rancher gets pushed off their land by a bigger one. They've seen it. Most of them don't like it. Clara thought about this. He could see her running it through her practical mind, testing it, looking for the failure points. The community meeting idea, she said finally. He hadn't said that word yet. What about it? If we're going to do this publicly, we should do it deliberately. Not just a legal filing, a meeting, Garrison's Grange Hall or somewhere like it. We invite every rancher in the county who's had trouble with Tillis or the Consolidated Valley Partnership, and we lay it out, and we let people decide what they're willing to do. He looked at her. It was a better version of what he'd been thinking. It was also considerably more exposed. Standing up in a room full of people and naming Tillis directly was a different kind of risk than a legal filing. That puts a target on us, he said. We already have a target on us, she said. At least this way we're doing something with it. He nodded slowly. You'd be there. Of course I'd be there. Some of those people still have opinions about the arrangement here. She looked at him with the level patience of someone who has been managing other people's opinions for 2 years and has not been much damaged by the experience. Let them, she said. The meeting was set for the second Thursday in May. In the 3 weeks between, Wade and Clara rode separately to every property they'd identified, told the story straight, and asked the question. Not everyone said yes. 2 operations that had been in legal trouble with Tillis declined. One because they were too close to the edge financially to risk escalating, one because the husband and wife couldn't agree, and the wife's caution won. Wade didn't blame either of them. Being cautious when you're broke is not cowardice, it's arithmetic. But Kimball said yes, and the Braiders on the South Fork said yes, and a widow named Irene Cassidy, who ran a small sheep operation and had been fighting a water access challenge for 18 months, said yes with a firmness that made clear she'd been waiting for someone to organize this for quite a while. 4 ranches, counting theirs. 4 sets of legal costs going to one consolidated filing. 4 voices saying the same thing in the same room. The night before the meeting, Wade came in from the last check on the cattle and found Clara at the table, not with the ledger, but with a piece of paper she turned over when he came in. He didn't ask what it was. He made coffee and sat across from her. "You're going to speak tomorrow," he said. "We both are. You should speak first." He looked at her over the mug. "You kept this ranch alive alone for 2 years before I came back. People know that. When you stand up and talk about what Tillis is doing, they're going to listen to it differently than if I say the same thing." She was quiet for a moment. "You're not wrong." "I know." She almost smiled. It was the almost that got him. The way humor moved through her expression without quite completing itself, like she was always half a step shy of letting herself be easy. "Are you nervous?" he said. "Some," she said. "I don't like rooms full of people looking at me." "You'll be fine." "You don't know that." "No," he admitted. "But I'll be there." She looked at him. In the kitchen light, her face was tired and steady and familiar, in the way that a place is familiar when you've been coming back to it for a long time. He'd been aware of her in the particular way for months now, carefully and without acting on it. But sitting here the night before something that was going to be hard, he was aware of it in a different way. Less careful, less managed. He did not say anything about it. There was tomorrow to get through first, and then whatever came after tomorrow, and there would be a right moment at some point, and this wasn't it. "Get some sleep," he said. "I will." She picked up the piece of paper she'd turned over. He caught a glimpse of it, notes of some kind, points she was going to make, and folded it. "Thank you, Wade." "For what?" She considered. "For asking Kimball before you told me. For coming home and asking me to stay." She paused. "For all of it." He didn't know quite what to do with that, so he said, "Get some sleep," again, and she went to her room, and he sat alone in the kitchen for a while with his cold coffee and the fire dying, and the feeling of tomorrow sitting in the room with him like a third person. The Grange Hall in Garrison held 40 people with some crowding. On the second Thursday of May, 53 people came. Not all of them were there because of Tillis. Some were there because word had gotten around that something was happening, and in a small county something happening is worth attending. Some were there because Irene Cassidy had talked to people, and Mabel Hobart had talked to people, and the network of women who actually ran most of the information in Coulter County had decided this was worth showing up for. Tillis was not there. His absence was so deliberate it was almost a presence. Clara spoke first. She stood at the front of the hall in her good gray dress with her notes in one hand and the other hand at her side, and she looked at the room the way she looked at a difficult piece of work, squarely, without flinching. Her voice was steady. She laid out the pattern, the purchase offers, the legal filings, the water challenges, the properties that had already been absorbed into the Consolidated Valley Partnership. She named the ranches. She named the amounts. She cited the documents because she had the documents, and she'd organized them in the way she organized everything, which was carefully and with attention to what was going to matter. When she finished, there was a silence that was the particular kind that happens when a room full of people is deciding what it thinks. Then Carl Hobart, from the third row, said, "How do we stop him?" And Harlan Kimball, from the back, said, "That's what we're here to figure out." The conversation that followed was not orderly. It was a room full of ranchers who had opinions and were not shy about them, and it went in several directions at once, and Wade spent 40 minutes managing it the way you manage cattle. Not pushing, just redirecting, keeping the energy moving towards something useful. He was better at this than he'd expected. Clara caught his eye once from the front of the room and gave him the smallest nod, which he understood to mean, "You're doing fine." At the end of 2 hours, they had 7 ranches signed to a joint legal challenge and a commitment to present the consolidated case to the Territorial Water Board rather than letting it stay in the county courts where Tillis had more influence. They had a meeting scheduled for 3 weeks out to formalize the arrangement with Dempsey present. They had enough raised in voluntary contribution to cover the first stage of legal costs without any one operation taking the full weight. 7 ranches. against one man who had more money than all of them combined, and lawyers who were better paid than Dempsey. It wasn't a victory. It was a better position than the one they'd been in. Wade had learned, in the mountains and in the years since, to take a better position seriously even when it wasn't a victory. Because in the kind of country where survival is a genuine question, a better position is what you build from. They rode home in the late spring evening, the light going long and gold across the valley, the Mercer land coming into view as they came down the ridge road. The cattle were in the south pasture, moving slowly in the evening way. The chimney of the house was dark. No fire burning yet. They'd both be cold when they got in. And the repaired fences ran clean lines across the hillside. Wade pulled up at the top of the ridge the way he always did, the old habit from that first day coming home, and looked down at it. Clara pulled up beside him. She looked down at it too. 7 ranches, she said. 7 ranches, he said. Is it enough? He was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was, he didn't know. The truer answer was something else. It's what we've got, he said, so we make it enough. She looked at him for a moment in the long evening light. Then she looked back at the ranch. Their ranch, both of theirs, documented and fought for, and held by margins too thin to be comfortable and too real to be anything but what they were. All right, she said, and put her heels to her horse and started down. He watched her go for just a moment. The set of her back, the way she rode with that particular economy of motion, like she'd made peace a long time ago with the fact that nothing was easy and had stopped spending energy being surprised by it. Then he put his heels to biscuit and followed her down toward the house, toward whatever the morning would bring, toward the next hard thing in a long line of hard things that neither of them had any intention of facing alone. The territorial water board hearing was scheduled for July, which gave Tillis 2 months to make things uncomfortable. He used them. The first move was through the bank, not Crane directly, who had learned his lesson about putting himself between Tillis and the Mercer mortgage, but through the board that sat above Crane, a group of men in the county seat who had financial relationships with the Consolidated Valley Partnership that nobody had bothered to make public. Wade learned about this from Dempsey, who had learned about it from a clerk who had a conscience and a loose enough tongue when she'd had occasion to be annoyed with her employers. The board was considering calling the Mercer note, not for missed payments, but on a technical clause buried in the original mortgage language about material changes in property ownership structure, the partnership agreement. The same partnership agreement Crane had already declared valid. They were circling back. Dempsey's response was a 12-page legal letter that Wade did not fully understand, but which Dempsey summarized as, "Try it, and we'll see you in territorial court for bad faith lending practices. And we'll make sure every rancher in this county knows the bank is being used as a collection tool for Grover Tillis." The board did not call the note. The 12-page letter cost $60. Wade paid it without flinching because flinching was what Tillis was counting on. The second move was more personal, and it landed harder. Someone, Wade never proved who, though he had a clear enough suspicion, began circulating a story through Garrison's social channels about Clara. The story had a specific shape, that she had come to the Mercer Ranch not out of any debt or principle, but because she'd had financial impropriety in her past, unpaid debts of her own in Missouri before Thomas died, and that her motivation for the partnership was to use Wade's name and land as cover while she rebuilt a reputation she'd ruined elsewhere. It was specific enough to sound researched and vague enough that it couldn't be directly refuted, which is the structure of a story that is designed to do damage rather than be true. Clara heard about it on a Friday in June from Mabel Hobart, who told her with the particular directness of a woman who believes you deserve to know what's being said about you so you can decide what to do about it. Clara came home that evening quieter than usual, and Wade knew from the quality of the quiet that something had happened. She told him at supper. Her voice was level. She told it the way she told most hard things, as information, not complaint. But he could see it in her hands, which were still in a way they usually weren't, and in the set of her jaw which had gone to the careful, controlled place it went when something had gotten through her guard. When she finished, he said, "It's not true." "I know it's not true," she said. "I know my own history." Then, "It's not about whether it's true." She looked at him. "It's about what people decide to do with it. If enough people hear it enough times, it doesn't have to be true to do damage." She looked at her plate. "The other ranchers, the ones who signed on to the joint challenge, if they start wondering whether the woman who organized the meeting has something to hide, Clara, I'm not saying I believe it. I'm saying it's a problem. He pushed his plate back. What do you want to do? She was quiet for a moment. I want to find out who started it, and I want to... She stopped. But I can't do that. That's what he wants. He wants us reacting instead of building. She took a breath. We do nothing. We let it run, and we keep working, and we show up to the hearing, and we do what we said we were going to do. Some people will believe it. Some people were always going to find a reason. She looked at him directly. You know what I was doing in Missouri before Thomas got sick? No, working my husband's farm, keeping his accounts, trying to have a child that didn't survive past 3 months. She said it quietly, without drama, as someone states a fact about a year that cost them something they don't get back. There were debts after Thomas died, because there are always debts after someone dies, and the person who managed the money is gone. I paid what I could, and I moved west because the land was cheaper and the possibilities were less already spoken for. She held his gaze. That's the whole story. It's not interesting enough to be a scandal. He was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, he said. About the child. She nodded once. It was the nod of someone who has made a degree of peace with something and doesn't need the sympathy reopened, but who appreciated it being seen. We show up to the hearing, she said. That's what we do. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. It was the first time he'd done that. She didn't move her hand away. They stayed like that for a moment, not saying anything, because there wasn't anything that needed saying, and then she turned her hand over and gave his a brief, firm press and took it back. They showed up to the hearing. The Territorial Water Board convened in a long, low building in the county seat on a Tuesday in July that was hot enough to make the air above the road shimmer and the horses fractious. There were 9 ranches represented in the room by the time the hearing started. 2 more had joined the Consolidated Challenge in June, word having spread through the Hobart Network and the meeting of the previous May. Dempsey sat at the table in the front with his papers organized in the manner of a man who has been doing this long enough to have a system. Clara sat beside Wade in the second row and had her own set of the documents in her lap because she didn't trust that Dempsey had everything, and she'd been proven right to double-check things before. Tillis's legal representation was a firm out of Helena, with 2 attorneys, well-dressed and well-prepared, carrying the particular confidence of people who bill by the hour and don't feel the cost of it. The board heard arguments for 6 hours with a break for midday. Tillis's attorneys argued the water allocation law with the precision of men who had read it extremely carefully and selected the most favorable interpretation. They were good at their jobs. Dempsey, who was one man and had been doing water law on the frontier for 20 years with the resources available to a small county practice, was good at his job in a different way. The way that comes from knowing the actual land and the actual people and the actual history, which the Helena attorneys had read about in documents but had not walked through in mud. When Dempsey put Harlan Kimball on the record to describe 3 specific seasons of water access on his property, including 1 year where the flow reduction had demonstrably cost him a portion of his calf crop, the board chair leaned forward and asked a question that the Helena attorneys didn't have a clean answer for. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It was a quiet one, a specific technical question about historical flow rates at a specific point on the creek system that Kimball could answer from 20 years of working that land and that no document in a filing could replace. Wade watched the attorneys exchange a look and understood that the hearing had shifted. The board did not rule that day. They took the matter under advisement, which in territorial board language meant they were going to argue among themselves for a while and come back with something. Dempsey said 3 weeks to a month. He said he thought it would go their way, but he had been wrong before, and he wasn't going to promise what he couldn't guarantee. They rode home that evening with the heat finally breaking, a late-day wind coming down off the mountains that smelled like pine and distant rain. Nobody said much. Harlan Kimball rode alongside Wade for a while and said, "That question the chairman asked, you know who put that in Dempsey's material?" Wade said he had a suspicion. Harlan said, "She's thorough." Wade said yes, she was. The ruling came in 22 days. The board upheld the historical usage rights of the 9 consolidated properties. It did not strip Tillis of his dare land or prevent him from using the upper creek as he saw fit on his own property, but it established a minimum flow requirement downstream that meant any structure he built would have to maintain adequate water access to the properties below him on the watershed. It was not everything. It was enough. Dempsey read the ruling in his office with Wade and Clara present, and then set it down and said, "He can still make things inconvenient, but he can't use the water as a weapon anymore." "Will he try something else?" Clara said. "Probably. But this cost him money and time, and he didn't get what he wanted, and men like Tillis calculate. If the next thing costs more than it returns, he finds easier ground to work." Dempsey folded the ruling and handed Wade the copy. "He's not gone, but you've made yourselves expensive. That's a real thing." It was a real thing, not a clean victory. There was no clean victory to be had against a man with Tillis's resources, only positions that made the next fight possible. But Wade had understood for a long time that clean victories were mostly something people described after the fact, looking back on a series of ugly, uncertain moments that had happened to go the right way. He stood outside Dempsey's office in the July heat, with Clara beside him, and the ruling in his hand, and felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled for the better part of 3 years. "It's over," he said, not triumphant, just noting it. "This part of it," she said. "Yes." He looked at her. "This part of it." She was squinting slightly in the afternoon sun, looking down the county seat's main street with the expression she wore when she was thinking past the current moment. He knew that expression well by now. He knew most of her expressions well. "There's something I've been meaning to say," he said. She looked at him. "I've been meaning to say it for a while, and I keep not saying it because there's always something that needs dealing with first." He was aware, as he said this, of the irony of the timing. Standing on a dusty street outside a lawyer's office in the county seat on a hot July afternoon was not where he'd imagined having this conversation. "That probably says something about me that isn't entirely flattering." She waited. She was good at waiting. "I don't want to be partners," he said. "I mean, I do. That's not—" He stopped. "I want more than that. I think you know that. I think you've known it for a while, and you've been waiting for me to find the words for it, which you've been patient about, and you didn't have to be." "I didn't mind waiting," she said. "Clara." "I know," she said quietly. "I know what you're saying." She looked at him steadily. I'm not a woman who—" She stopped. It was the first time he'd seen her struggle with words. Thomas was a long time ago, and what we have here is— She took a breath. "It's different. I didn't expect it to be what it is." "What is it?" he said. He needed to hear her say it. She looked at the street, looked back at him. "Something I don't want to lose," she said. "Something I would have told you a long time ago if I'd been braver about it." He reached out and took her hand, right there on the street in the county seat where anyone could see, and she let him, and they stood like that in the July heat outside Dempsey's office while a wagon went by and a dog barked somewhere down the block, and the ordinary afternoon continued around them without any awareness of its own significance. They were married in October, on the hill behind the ranch. Not the hill above the creek with Margaret's grave. That was not the right place for this, and they both knew it without discussing it. A different hill, on the west side of the property, where you could see the whole valley laid out below, the fall color in the timber on the far ridge, the cattle small and moving in the south pasture, the ranch buildings with their repaired roofs and good fences, and a kitchen garden that had finally, in its 3rd season of Clara's management, produced a potato crop that could see them through the winter without supplementing. Carl and Mabel Hobart were there. Harlan and Ada Kimball, Irene Cassidy, who brought her own chair because she had a bad knee, Dempsey, who shook both their hands afterward with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has watched a complicated situation arrive at a good outcome. A dozen other neighbors who had become something closer to friends over the years of shared hardship and shared legal battles, and the particular solidarity of people who have staked their survival on each other. It was not an elegant ceremony. The justice of the peace was a man named Birch, who was also the county surveyor and who read from a card he'd used many times and which showed it. Wade's good jacket had a button missing that he'd noticed that morning and not been able to fix. Clara's dress was the nicest thing she owned, which was a dark blue wool she'd bought in Garrison the previous spring and which she'd altered herself to fit better, and she'd done a good job with it, but a stitch at the left shoulder seam came loose sometime during the afternoon, and she spent the second half of the reception holding herself at a slight angle so it wouldn't show, which Wade noticed and which he liked more than any version of her that was perfectly put together would have been. They didn't make speeches. They were not people who made speeches. Harlan Kimball toasted them with his hat because he'd left his glass somewhere, which got a laugh, and Mabel Hobart cried, which she had apparently decided to do regardless of whether anyone else was going to, and the afternoon went on in the easy, slightly disorganized way of an event that was not planned by people who plan events. Wade stood with his wife on that hill and looked at what they had built, and thought about the boy he'd been when he first broke this ground, and the man who had left on a cattle drive that almost killed him, and the man who'd come back to smoke rising from his chimney and a stranger on his porch, and the person he was now, which was not the same as any of those people, and was also all of them at once. He thought about Margaret in the way he thought about her now, with love and loss and the particular complicated grief of someone who has outlived a chapter of themselves and knows it. She would have liked Clara. He was almost certain of that. Margaret had no patience for performance or pretension, and absolute patience for people who showed up and did the work, and Clara was nothing if not that. He was not going to stop missing Margaret. He'd understood that for a while now. Grief doesn't leave by being replaced. It just makes room, slowly, and sometimes painfully, for whatever comes next. What had come next, in his case, was a woman who'd kept his ranch alive while he was lost in the mountains, who'd put a stone on his first wife's grave because a wooden cross wasn't enough, who'd organized 7 ranches against a man with more money and power than all of them combined, and who had, when asked what they had together, said something I don't want to lose in a voice that was the most honest thing he'd ever heard. He had loved 2 women in his life. That was not a contradiction. It was just a life. Clara stood beside him with the loose shoulder seam and the view of the valley, and her hand in his, and she wasn't looking at the view. She was looking at the cattle in the south pasture with the appraising attention of someone calculating next season's calf numbers, which was so completely her that he had to look away before she caught him smiling. 42 head, she said. Don't count cattle at your wedding, he said. I'm estimating, she said. There's a difference. The years that followed were not easier years. That would be too simple a thing to say about a life on the frontier, where simple is rarely what happens, and easy is mostly a word for other places. There were bad harvests, one summer that was dry enough to kill 2/3 of the kitchen garden and require selling cattle early, which cost them on price the way selling early always does. There was a winter when Wade broke 2 ribs on a fence post and couldn't do full work for 6 weeks, and Clara managed the ranch with Hobart's youngest son hired on at day rates, paying him out of the margin they didn't have much of. There was a lawsuit, small, quickly resolved, when one of Tillis's subsidiary operations challenged their water usage again, testing the ruling from the territorial board, and they paid Dempsey to respond, and the challenge went away within the month. Tillis himself began pulling back from the valley around 1886. Wade heard it from Kimball first. The Consolidated Valley Partnership had overextended in the eastern part of the territory, and some of the operations had gone underwater in a bad cattle year, and Tillis had been concentrating his resources on properties where his control was already complete. He was not gone from the county. He was simply no longer focused on the valley the way he had been. And in the absence of his focused attention, the smaller ranches breathed a little easier. It was not justice, exactly. It was the way things tend to resolve when a powerful man turns his attention elsewhere. Wade didn't spend much time wishing it had been more satisfying. He had learned in the mountains and the years after not to spend energy wanting things to be different from what they were. The ranch was his and Clara's. The mortgage was current. The cattle were in good condition. That was the account that mattered. They paid the final mortgage payment in the spring of 1889. Crane had retired by then. His health had been declining, and the county banking operation had passed to a younger man named Lawless, who had no particular connection to Tillis and no reason to be difficult. Clara had organized the final payoff carefully over 2 years, building the reserve in a separate column in the ledger, watching it accumulate the way she watched everything that mattered, with patient, unglamorous attention, never assuming the number would be there until it was. The day they made the final payment, they rode to Garrison together. Clara handed the check to Hollis, who was efficient and congratulatory in the professional way, and stamped the mortgage document paid and handed it back. They were in Hollis's office for 11 minutes. When they came out, Clara had the document in her hand, and she stood on the steps of the bank building in the spring morning and looked at it for a moment. Wade watched her. She folded it once along a crease and put it in her coat pocket. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. She started down the steps. He fell in beside her. "I was thinking," she said as they walked toward where the horses were tied, "about the East Quarter. If we redirect the drainage another 20 yards south, we could bring another 4 acres into production next season." 4 acres, he said. Maybe 5. He thought about it. "That's another season of work before we see return on it." "Yes, but the return would be, worth it," he said. She looked at him. "I didn't finish." "I know, but you were going to say worth it, so I saved you the time." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You've gotten smug." "I've gotten accurate," he said. She almost smiled, the almost as always. There is something that people who survive hard things sometimes understand and sometimes don't, and it has to do with what the hard things are actually for. The common version of the story, the one that gets told at gatherings and passed down in the simplified form that stories take when they travel, is that Wade Mercer went away and came back and found a woman who had saved his ranch, and it was a miracle of loyalty and they lived well ever after. And that version is not untrue exactly. It just leaves out the texture. It leaves out the broken pump handle in the blizzard, and the $40 lawyer's letter, and the shoulder seam that came loose at the wedding. It leaves out the argument about the cattle rotation that Wade lost because he didn't have enough humility to admit he'd been gone, and she'd been here, and she knew things he didn't. It leaves out the February mornings when Clara would sit with her coffee and her private thoughts, and not need anyone to fill the silence, and Wade would make the coffee and leave it there, and go out to do the morning work. And that was, in its way, the best thing he ever did for her. It leaves out the fact that the kindness Wade did in Garrison in 1879, the $64, the paid receipt, the writing out without giving his name, was not performed with any expectation of return. He had not calculated it. He had not even particularly remembered it until Clara sat across his kitchen table and told him about a man who'd come to her door and then left. He had simply done it because it was in front of him to do, and it seemed wrong not to. That is the piece that doesn't fit neatly into the version of the story people tell. Because we want kindness to be intentional in the way that investments are intentional. We want it to have been calculated to come back. But it doesn't work that way. It works the way seeds work, which is that you put something in the ground, and you don't know what it becomes or when, or whether a particular drought in a particular year is going to take it before it has time to root. Most things don't come back. Most acts of ordinary decency go nowhere visible. The math of kindness is not reliable math, but sometimes. Sometimes a thing travels through years and distance and other people's decisions and arrives back in a form you couldn't have anticipated, and when it does, it is not a reward for good behavior. It is not the universe settling accounts. It is just the way that one small, decent thing, given freely and without condition, became large enough to matter in ways that nobody planned. Wade understood this in the way that understanding tends to come, not as a sudden clarity, but as a slow accumulation, like knowing that it's morning because the room has gotten incrementally lighter, and at some point you realize you can see your hands. He understood it the evening he found Clara sitting on the hill above the west pasture, the one where they'd gotten married, watching the valley go into shadow, the way the valley goes every evening in that country, gradually the light leaving the flat ground first and staying longest on the ridges. He sat beside her without being asked. They watched the light together. "Do you ever think about it?" she said. "About what?" "About how different it would be if you hadn't stopped in Garrison." She wasn't looking at him. "If you'd ridden past." He thought about it honestly, the way she deserved. "Sometimes," he said, "I try to remember why I stopped." "Do you?" "Not well. I remember hearing about it from the feed merchant. I remember it seemed..." He paused. "Wrong to walk past." She nodded. "I've thought about that a lot," she said, "whether I would have done it. The same thing, if I'd been passing through." "What do you think?" She was quiet for a moment. "I think I would have wanted to," she said. "I don't know if I would have. Wanting and doing are different things." She turned to look at him. "You didn't just want to, you did it." "It was $64. "It was $64 and everything after it," she said. The valley was in shadow now, the light up on the far ridge going from gold to orange to the particular pale that comes just before it disappears. The cattle were settling for the evening. The ranch buildings were small and solid below them, chimney smoke rising, the fences running their straight lines across the hillside, the whole thing looking, from up here, like something that had been planned, like something that had been built by people who knew what they were making, which was not true at all. They had built it one crisis at a time, one payment at a time, one argument resolved, and one winter survived, and one legal filing answered with another legal filing. They had built it badly and stubbornly, and in the particular way that two imperfect people build anything together, which is by deciding over and over that the thing is worth the cost. The light left the ridge. "Come on," Clara said. "I haven't started supper yet." She got up and started down the hill, and Wade followed, and the evening closed around them the way evenings do in that country, completely, without ceremony, the dark coming in from the east the way it always has. Below, the Mercer Ranch held its ground in the October dark. The cattle breathed in the south pasture. The fences stood. The chimney would be lit soon, the kitchen warm by the time they got there. Two people coming in from the cold to something they had built from almost nothing and refused to let go. And in the creek stone corner of the western hill, a carved limestone marker held two names, Margaret's and the years of her life, in letters that had weathered now into the stone as though they had always been there, tended by no one and by the seasons both, standing in the tall grass of an October evening while the ranch that bore her husband's name endured below her, alive and imperfect and entirely real. That is the whole of it. Not a miracle. Not a perfect story. Just what happens sometimes when one person does a decent thing and another person decides it deserves to be answered, and both of them refuse, through all the cold and the cost and the years of hard work, to let it simply disappear.